Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And today on the podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about, I want to call it the Wolverine trilogy.
That's what it's called on Wikipedia, oddly enough.
Oh, really?
If you even know it was a trilogy. It's almost an accidental trilogy.
It's kind of an accidental trilogy because it really comes out of the X-Men films, but it certainly has a progression, and I think coming off of doing the Dark Knight trilogy episode where we were talking about how well things went for the most part, I think the Wolverine films are an interesting study of how you can kind of start in maybe a little bit of a hole and correct.
Yeah, even with the X-Men films too, but that's a whole nother bag of cats.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll save that when Marvel Studios makes a certain announcement. Maybe we'll dig into that one. That's going to be a long one anyway. But I think this would be an interesting parallel to the Dark Knight trilogy in a way. Yeah. And also, with New Mutants, the last of the Fox-produced X-Men films coming out, 20th Century Films now. Yeah. It's a good time to discuss, I think, some of this. But let's kind of get up to speed to where we're going to start. So around 2004... as work is already being done on X-Men The Last Stand, it seemed like the general direction amongst the producers was that they wanted to keep away from the team movies for a while, and it's understandable. Last Stand is kind of an end to the X-Men films.
Yeah, it even kind of follows the comics too, like they do these big crossover stories, like Claremont did this all the time, and then he would focus on like small character moments, especially in the late 80s. But so I don't think it was a bad direction for the studios to go into after all, especially after how notorious Last Stand became.
Yeah, and Last Stand is a topic that we'll definitely get into in the future. But you can see the idea that they had. Around the same time, they're also developing a solo Magneto film, a lot of which apparently became First Class. So the first, solid thing that really can be confirmed is David Benioff, who would go on to Game of Thrones, gets hired as writer in October of 2004. It seems like shortly after that, Skip Woods, who was writing Hitman for Fox as well.
Oh, jeez.
Benioff stated that his script was aiming for a darker tone, if not an R. And I think the movie we get, you can see moments where it probably should have been. But as time progresses, more and more rewrites come in. Hugh Jackman, who was working as a producer on the movie, had influence over the script. Apparently pretty direct from what I was reading. David Ayer did a pass. And then it seems like that script, that would be what they were going into production with, is really done in fall of 2008. The film got pushed back a little bit because Hugh Jackman in 2007 was heading to do Australia, which that could be a podcast, I'm sure. Stories about that movie.
Not the memories of that flooding back.
Yeah. And right before they go into production, James Vanderbilt, who at the time was probably best known for Darkness Falls, though he would go on to work on Zodiac, and Scott Silver, who had written 8 Mile, did sort of the last rewrite on the script.
This is an insane amount of people kind of coming in to salvage the script. I know this happens now, but it's usually in the shadows and is much more controlled. Usually you have writers doing a dialogue pass or an action pass. This just seems like people trying to salvage something.
Which is interesting because, as we were saying, it's not too far off from the timing of, Batman Begins, where they start. So, if you want to see the difference in process, go listen to the last podcast and you'll see, how contrived this is compared to that film already. So Gavin Hood in 2007 does get announced as director. This was after a really long search. It's almost irrelevant to go through every director that was asked. Apparently Zack Snyder was a real frontrunner, though, but couldn't because he had already committed to Watchmen at that point. They had asked him to do Last Stand. He turned it down, and they had come back to him to do X-Men Origins, but he had already committed to Watchmen and couldn't do the project.
That's interesting. I would have liked to see a Zack Snyder Wolverine.
I think a Zack Snyder Wolverine could have been really cool. We might have gotten that R Wolverine right out of the gate. Though, quite frankly, from everyone's input from creative, it seems like a lot of the creative forces were trying to push it that direction that early. So they get into shooting. The story, as it's presented on the internet through some interviews, is there was immediately problems with the producers in the studio from Hood's point of view. Hood seemed to be trying to maintain the sort of darker vision that Benioff had implied. It's also pretty relevant to note that apparently Gambit and I guess we should say Wade Wilson, because we don't really get a real Deadpool in this, were last minute changes to this script, that they didn't come in until later. It sounds like there was some sort of Weapon X. Deadpool was being developed independently, and then when they killed that project, they brought it in because they were interested in using the character. So even going into these last couple of stages right before shooting, it seems like the studio and the producers were kind of manipulating things.
Well, I also imagine, too, like, this is kind of in the period where our movies were very much a no-no. At this point, we would only really get, like, Kick-Ass as, like, an R-rated comic book movie. And even then, that did not set off, like, an R-rated phenomenon like Deadpool would later. So I don't know why the studios would say, like, we want an R-rated Wolverine and then not commit to it at all.
It's interesting. I think, it's all about precedent, which is something we're going to talk about going forward in this too. I guess they weren't confident that it could be successful. You have to look back at something like Darkman, though it actually did have its audience. That's really, even going into this is your best example of a rated R superhero film. I wouldn't count The Punisher. I wouldn't count anything like that because The Punisher's not really a superhero. They don't have the evidence to back it up, and the primary concern of any of studio production is going to be to make money. But it gets bad enough that Richard Donner essentially has to go to set to intervene. Now, it sounds like, from what I was reading, that Hood got along with Donner, which is part of the reason he was there. But it also sounds like that if Hood had decided not to do anything that the producers wanted, that Richard Donner would have just taken over the production.
Jeez.
Which, a movie directed by the director of Superman the movie, could have been interesting too. But ultimately, Hood kind of, it seems like, comes out with this movie that is what the studio wanted more than what he wanted.
Yeah, you can definitely tell by watching it. It seems like such a jumbled mess. Do we want to get into it?
Yeah, I think there's one thing that I want to touch on beforehand, though, just because this is incredibly significant. In March of 2009, this is only a couple of months before the film is supposed to be released, a work print leaks. And I mean leaks. They estimated 15 million downloads of the work print. I don't pursue, bootlegs. I say the only exception to that is if there's something that, cannot be watched, and the only way you can find it is by kind of trying to track it down. Yeah, maybe that's when I'll look for a bootleg. Even I saw this work print because so many of my friends had it, and we watched it, and I remember thinking with the end sequence, and there were certainly things in that work print that were, completely missing special effects. I remember watching that end sequence, which we would later find out was fairly complete, and going, oh, I better clean this up quite a bit. And if you want to know kind of, the whole feeling of X-Men Origins Wolverine, it's that. It's like, man, this sure should have been better.
Oh, yeah, especially in that messy ending.
But, there are things, I think what's important to point out is you do get your first Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool.
I mean, they pretty violently retcon that.
Yeah, eventually. But I would make the argument that if there's a strong part of that movie, it is that first act where they do sort of the opening montage where you see him going from childhood through all the wars, and you get him to the point where he's acting in that version of the Weapon X program. I thought those sequences are fine. I thought it's your first indication of Ryan Reynolds really getting the Deadpool character. I actually think it's a really great Sabretooth, though he's just Creed in the film.
Liev Schreiber is probably the best casting, and Ryan Reynolds. I know Ryan Reynolds loves Deadpool, absolutely, and you can tell from the film that he had the most input into that character. Yeah,
well, he also was, with the project that was dumped beforehand, he was actually already involved at that point, too, from my understanding. He wanted to be Deadpool before it was cool to be Deadpool. Other than that, the film kind of loses any darkness as it goes, just because it gets so wacky, which I think is perhaps the redeeming quality of it now, years later, is he gets in a boxing match with the Blob. It's
It is bizarre.
It's a bizarre movie that you can appreciate now, but at the time, everyone for years had been hearing the rumors that, everyone working on it was talking R. They were talking dark. And Wolverine's solo stories tend to be dark. They tend to be violent. So when you got your first, Wolverine solo story, you can hit the ground running because you just already had 3 movies with him in it. Everyone's familiar with the character, familiar with the person portraying the character. It was just a real big letdown.
Yeah, I actually wrote notes on this because I was so perplexed watching it. Most of it came in the first 5 minutes because, it goes from Logan, he has a different name. It's James in the
James
movie.
Howlett, yeah. As it is in Origin, so.
And, but he goes from being sick to killing his foster dad, who turns out not to be his real dad, to killing his actual dad, and then being abandoned by his mother, all in the span of 3 minutes.
Well, that's what happens when you try to do 6 issues of a comic as your introduction.
But it's so weird to me because they tried to do the Weapon X thing, and it feels so thoroughly explored in the X-Men trilogy that I'm kind of why bother doing that? Because they don't add anything interesting to it. The interesting part is him being in the Civil War, Vietnam or things like that.
I agree with, the story that ends up being told. However, one of my instincts, the first time I watched it, even in the work print, one of my first thoughts was, man, why didn't we stick with, 45 minutes of the Weapon X program? Because if you're just exploring the fact that they're exploiting mutants, yeah, X2 did that really effectively. You don't really need to go back to it. But if you were telling a story about a group of, military mutants, that would have been new.
That would have been really cool, especially with that plot line about, them capturing other mutants for experiments. That could have been the whole movie. But instead they throw in, God loves man kills into it and everything, and it just becomes really bizarre. They make Deadpool a gene pool of other mutants, which is kind of a weird way somebody's brain works.
Yeah, it's sort of it's that argument, and, this has gotten mentioned on the site, I'm sure we've said it on the podcast before, is, plot is the easy part. Figuring out, the types of things you have to hit on is easy. It's all in that execution. This is, an incredibly good example where the plot was probably there, just the wrong things were accentuated constantly for 2 hours. And the thing is, you're also not the cast was great.
Well, except for Will.i.am.
Will.i.am is fine. He just disappears. He's got John Wraith. I remember everyone bugging out because who's John Wraith? It's it's all right. A teleporter. Great. I think Gambit was probably a little miscast.
I mean, he didn't have much to do. I think it would have been cool to see Gambit running around. I do like him being an escaped prisoner. You are right. It feels like it's constantly accentuating the wrong things in this movie.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of things in this movie that are totally fine conceptually. I think some of the special effects execution was pretty weak.
Well, what about that last shot with all the mutants going to Professor X's helicopter?
Oh boy!
And there's the worst green screen and After Effects possible.
And there's the one claw pop.
Oh yeah,
it's completely digital and it just looks horrific. Which they should have and that's there you go. If you want to know what can sum up how this movie comes out is a claw pop from Wolverine on movie 4, where it had looked fine for 3 movies, looks bad. That's perfect. That's exactly how to define this movie, is the pieces are all there. It just doesn't come together. We have a good indication of why.
Well, and then, once that claw pop happens, he cuts up the bathroom of these farmers' houses who just get blown up, and then there's a big helicopter chase.
Yeah, and then it's Maverick shows up. Not Maverick, yeah.
Agent X.
Agent X.
Or Agent Zero, sorry.
Oh, is he Zero? Yeah.
Zero and X, they say a lot in this movie.
Yeah. Well, Agent X is Alex Hayden. We don't have to get into Agent X. It's good if you ever get a chance to read the Gail Simone Agent X stuff, do it. It's good. But, lo and behold, the movie makes money.
Funny story, I went to see this with my dad and his girlfriend, and she's like, I want to see this because Hugh Jackman's going to be shirtless in it. And guaranteed, he was shirtless for most of the movie.
It's really funny. I think that's part of the reason Thor the Dark World made money, too. So as the movie's even, about to be released, they pretty much confirm the sequel.
Right away,
Not unlike the production of X-Men Origins, though. The production of the sequel has a lot of delays, has a lot of issues, in part because of Hugh Jackman's schedule. Now, at this point, Hugh Jackman's a huge international star.
Yeah, and he's doing on Broadway and things like that.
He's always looking at the next project as it's coming up, was basically what the research reflected, that Jackman didn't overcommit, really. Like, he wouldn't sign a 5-movie deal for these movies. Like, if they showed him what they were going to do, he might sign, for a couple of movies, but it was never this, like, all-inclusive, like, Marvel Studios thing where you sign for, like, 8 movies up front.
Yeah, those poor guys.
Jackman was, like, legitimately looking at these films and trying to decide whether it was the right thing to do or not. First indications of a script being written are in 2009, when Origins has just come out. Pretty much from that point until the movie's out, everyone is talking about Japan. It's one of the endings you could have gotten on X-Men Origins was Wolverine in Japan.
But instead they erase his memory and make the whole movie pointless.
That's true. This was not a secret that this was going to happen. Initially, we get a script from Christopher McQuarrie, who had worked on X-Men but was uncredited on that. It seems like most of the base ideas are there at this point. It's not terribly long after this, in October of 2010, that Hugh Jackman confirms that Darren Aronofsky is supposed to direct the film, which is interesting. Once again, Aronofsky's name popping up for a superhero project that he doesn't end up doing.
Yeah, I would be curious to see, like, an Aronofsky superhero movie. I don't know how much superhero would be in an Aronofsky superhero movie, but it would still be interesting.
Yeah, and, even from his early interviews, he kind of talked about that he wanted this to be more of a character study. Everyone was saying sequel to Origins. He was the first one to kind of pull back on that. Though, ultimately, what we do get isn't not a sequel to Origins. It's just another Wolverine movie that happens to take place after Last Stand.
Weirdly enough, which they don't really talk about a whole lot in that film. I remember seeing this in theaters and having no idea it was actually a sequel to Last Stand.
I see how people overlook it, but they do it. They do have Jean show up, and if you saw Last Stand, she's not around anymore, and that's what he's dealing with. It makes sense. So around June 2011, James Mangold comes on to the project. Once again, there was a lot of directors interested and spoken to about this. Guillermo del Toro being one of them, who said he eventually turned it down because he saw how much of a time commitment it was going to be. And as we all know, Guillermo del Toro has to write like 6 or 7 scripts a year.
And none of them gets produced.
Yeah, every once in a while he makes a movie, but he didn't want to commit the amount of time that he would have to. That itself almost parallels The Hobbit, too, where he was supposed to be on for the whole ride and then kind of wanted to do other stuff.
That's a whole episode in itself. Poor Peter Jackson on The Hobbit.
But, so Mangold ends up taking over the project, ends up making his own adjustments, and we get the film that becomes The Wolverine. I really like The Wolverine. I think it's really cool.
I like bits of it. I think the plot's a bit predictable, but I do like their attempts at making like a more personal Wolverine. I remember being kind of confused by a lot of it, just because I didn't immediately know it was a sequel directly to Last Stand. But I did like the first 15 minutes where it's very slow. Wolverine's in Hiroshima saving that guy from the World War II bombers and everything. I thought that was a really cool thing, and him being brought over to Japan to talk to this guy on his last legs and seeing Wolverine have to deal with that and eventually have to deal with death.
Yeah, and there's a lot of the Claremont Miller Wolverine in there. There's a good amount of the Marvel Comics Presents Wolverine, just imagery-wise, things like that. The Wolverine is not, a perfect movie. I wouldn't put it in, top 5 superhero movies or anything. But I think it's effective at what it's trying to do. I think it wants to be, a very, 80s Wolverine movie. It wants to be that type of Wolverine story. They do get that twist in there where you find out Ishida this entire time has been the bad guy, and then Harada, who, if you read the comics, is normally the Silver Samurai, is not, and ends up being a pretty decent guy. I think it was a cool movie that has its flaws. The third act gets a little weird with the giant robot Silver Samurai.
Yeah, I really didn't like that part.
Mutant Viper is kind of weird, but nothing, I say it's weird, but that's because I've read so many of the comics and it's the characters are a little off. But if I had no idea who these characters were and they introduced them as that, I feel like it wouldn't bother me.
Yeah, at this point I haven't read most of the Claremont stuff, so it didn't bother me at that point. I felt like a lot of the robots and a lot of like the mutant stuff felt very out of place, especially since it felt like a very urban storytelling. Then you have all these ninjas show up and shoot Wolverine with all these like rope arrows and everything and hold him down and strap him to like a train.
You see, what's funny is that sequence to me could have been the climax. Like, that would have been, more, to me, like, more of the appropriate climax for that movie. Because it is it's a samurai story, you know, like that kind of, the lone warrior returns and, you know, it's all about honor and how you're supposed to act with these people that have helped you. And you kind of lose it a little bit when, you know, the end game is a giant robot.
Who want Wolverine's blood.
Right. Then again, stuff like that is a big part of X-Men. And it actually hadn't been played up that much in the X-Men films at that point.
I think that's why it felt weird. Eventually we would get Days of Future Past, which is probably the most X-Men the X-Men movies have been.
Yeah, it definitely X-Men's the hardest of the X-Men movies.
But this is kind of this is kind of like a weird middle ground where it's not like too wacky and not too grounded. So while I like this way better than Origins, I don't know, it just didn't sit right with me, especially since I forgot most of it and I had to rewatch it.
It does transition pretty cleanly into Days of Future Past, though. You have to accept that Days of Future Past would be, like, decades after this. But that ending with Professor X and sort of this idea that things are about to get worse again, yeah, like, it's kind of, it's there. I think it is a good setup for where X-Men ends up going. And like I said, I agree. Like, I think you could have had a stronger movie if you had pulled off of the sort of sci-fi themes, and not that it's not all sci-fi, but the really, like, overt comic booky sci-fi themes that you hit at the end of it. I think if you had pulled back off of that, you probably would have gotten a more critically acclaimed film. But I still think it's good. And I also think it's interesting that even here, Mangold is trying to push it to R. The R cut exists. You can watch that on the Blu-ray. It's good. It's, you know, a little more violent. I don't think it necessarily was bad at PG-13, and I don't necessarily think the R cut adds anything, like, mind-blowing. But the fact that that intention is still going through everything is really important of where we end up.
He had a hard job coming off of, like, making a direct sequel to Last Stand, because that was a very, like, sci-fi X-Men, and he had to blend a lot of that together. Especially to where he wants to go next.
So, almost immediately, again, talks begin about making this film. As I mentioned before, Jackman hadn't really committed to doing a third one. There was no contract in place. But now with this confidence, this ability to maybe push a little harder for something darker, we get the movie that will be called Logan. Once again, the same thing with Jackman. He's going off doing a lot of projects. It takes 4 years to get this movie released, which used to be normal, now seems like an eternity. But James Mangold is pretty much already working on it by the time the Wolverine stops. Scott Frank, who was one of the writers on Get Shorty, works on it, as does Michael Green, who at the time was just coming off of Green Lantern, which maybe is an indication that that wasn't his fault. But they'll all eventually be nominated for an Academy Award for this movie.
Well deserved, too. It is a cap to an era like Days of Future Past quite wasn't. That was like a plot cap to X-Men, and this is more like a character cap, where it kind of helps close off all the loops of these characters you've kind of grew up with since like 2002.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people, it's almost like everyone who saw Logan, not in the way that, you know, X-Men Origins Wolverine was a prequel. Or it was supposed to be, even though nothing matched up. The Wolverine was very much a sequel to Last Stand. And you could accept that this was like that character you would watch through those films moving forward. Logan is like, depending on who you ask, it's either a sequel or it's like its own thing that takes place completely out of continuity. And what's cool about it is it doesn't matter because the story is so good and it's so thematically focused on what makes the X-Men work that you could really see it however you want to see it. You know, you have a huge amount of time in between whatever you decide is the last time you saw Wolverine. And you now have this aging Professor X who, you know, something went terribly wrong because of his aging. They're living with a version of Caliban.
Yeah.
And Wolverine's powers are starting to diminish because essentially they discover that eventually, no matter what you do, even mutant genes start to degenerate.
Yeah, and there's also adamantium poisoning and things like that.
Yeah, well, that would be the result, though, of the degeneration of his abilities because he can't fight off the fact that he has all this metal in his body anymore. Which apparently is all based off of real genetic science, too, that at certain points, like, genetic code just starts to break down as people get older, and, like, it's... I'm not an expert in this, you can look it up. But it was all, like, rooted in science that, all right, we're saying these characters are all based on this genetic stuff, then maybe this is what happens. I think Logan brings back the mystique to Wolverine because you have a situation where Wolverine has been inactive. Everything has gone to shit in the world. And he's kind of forced to come out of retirement. But that's sort of the perpetual state of Wolverine. It's like Wolverine never wants to be a hero, and then he ends up the hero. You get to play with a few mutants who never showed up before. You're still playing with the Weapon X stuff, essentially, because it's all about creating these weapons, and that's how we get X-23, or Laura. And then you also get the closest thing that they'll ever do to Albert on screen with the clone Wolverine. But I think what's really cool is you finally get that sort of unleashed violence that you've pictured in your head. Like, X2 did a really good job of making you think you saw it. That's just good direction, and that's why, you know, no matter how many sort of, like, pseudo-bombs Bryan Singer's had, like, you know he can do it.
Pseudo-bombs?
I would say pseudo-bombs, yeah. I mean, there are a couple of bombs. Fine. There are a couple of bombs. But I always thought that was like a really good proof of his ability was X2's like Wolverine freaking out in the mansion scene because there's no blood. You see almost nothing, but in your head it's a massacre. Here you get to see the massacre.
Yeah, we actually see people's limbs flying off. I mean, it starts off really hard when he basically kills those two gangsters on the board and just chops their limbs off. And What I appreciate a lot about this film is that it deals with like a lot of themes all at once, and it's kind of like a dystopian look at the future, which is always what X-Men's kind of about in a weird way.
Right. I think that's a cool point to make too, especially now after House of X, where you had that was anchored by the fact that it never works out. And this is what I'll say. I saw Logan as a sequel to Days of Future Past.
So I just saw it as a standalone.
But I see the sequel to Days of Future Past because of this. So the end, in theory, of Days of Future Past is that they correct the timeline, not correct the timeline, change the timeline, and we would have gotten to a point in what would have been like a contemporary era where all your Prime X-Men are alive. They're all still at the mansion. I see this as taking place after that. Something goes terribly wrong again because it's the X-Men, and something always goes terribly wrong. And now we're left in this state where, like, Wolverine has the memories of everything. He remembers all the timelines. He remembers all the stuff that happened to him. And he's dealing with this now, and he still becomes the hero.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, because he is... I think the way this dystopia works in Logan is that it's not like a sudden climactic dissolve. It's a slow crumble over time, like... one thing doesn't work out, then another thing that doesn't work out. Until eventually you get to this state where, like, they're in the desert with, in their failures, their inability to have fixed anything. And I like the way it plays with, like, social issues, like a lot of government issues and things like that, because you see characters that have grown out of, like, seeing the X-Men as heroes. The main villain with the robot arm shows up, and he's like, I remember watching you, and then they're reading comic books of the X-Men. And I think that's what I really love about this film, is captures, like, that feeling of the X-Men being heroes.
Yeah, I like it too, and I also like that they go back to sort of what the one lost ethos of, like, the original three is... that they never went so far where they were, like, really superhero-y, and that had a lot to do with the culture at the time. You know, like, by the time you get to Days of Future Past, you not only want a superhero X-Men movie, but it's kind of socially acceptable now to have them be, like, really superhero-y. It goes back to that, like, subtlety that this is what's going on. Like, you know, the Reavers are there, and they are cyborgs. You just have to pay attention. They're not going to beat you over the head with it, except for, like, Donald Pierce's arm, which... is subtle enough to look believable. Like, you would believe, like, if we're a little into the future that maybe people would have prosthetics like that. But if you watch the other ones, they all are kind of, like, robotic, too. It's it's the right type of framing to both do exactly what X-Men is and to make it feel a little more like hard science fiction.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way that I like that you see like a government kind of like preying on the underprivileged, trying to do these experiments, and that's where Laura X-23 comes out of, and Logan eventually just trying to do one right thing before he goes on and dies. And that like last shot with the X in the woods, I think is a really great shot, especially as those young mutants escape into the wild to build their own lives. I mean, it's still like a shitty life they have to build, but they have a life to build now. And which is kind of the whole idea of Wolverine, is like him overcoming all this shit over and over again. And like the scars eventually making him into a better person. Which is kind of why I don't like the clone Wolverine, because I feel like this is my personal, like, I guess fan fiction-y idea. I think it would have been better to have Dakin or something as who Wolverine fights, because I feel like that would be a better representations of the sins of his past than just like a literal clone of himself.
I disagree, because I don't see it as a representation of the sins of his past at this point. I see it as the people who would do this, like the Weapon X, the Reavers, misunderstanding why Wolverine was such a successful like asset. Like they're just trying to create this brutal, like a monster, a beast.
Yeah.
And they don't get that that's not what made him special. And him being able to defeat that clone in the end, though it does, ultimately cost him his life, is like the ultimate proof of how valuable he was this entire time. And 100%, that's also why I like the idea that this is a Wolverine that remembers all those timelines and went through all that shit, because that makes that death like the peak of all of these movies. Like, absolutely. That's it. Like, it's, I was never one who turned away from the ones after Logan, though I know a substantial amount of people did, because a lot of people felt like that was the end. I can't help but like think that thematically, even people who weren't thinking about it that hard, like, didn't want to go back to that world because that world was now done.
Yeah, I kind of agree, because like I had no desire to see Apocalypse after this. I think it would have been better if they just redid the whole X-Men thing, but having to go back and go to Apocalypse is kind of doesn't feel the same, because it felt like X-Men had their end, and that end was in Logan, and that torch was passed on to a new generation. That was the group X-23 was a part of, Laura was a part of. Like, this is now their burden to carry. I don't want to see Jean Grey freak out over the fucking Dark Phoenix again. Like, I've had that.
And let's be honest too, like, as someone who, like I said, I want to support the other movies, and I think maybe New Mutants is going to open up a totally different door, especially the way that it looks from the trailers, that it's going to be a very different tone from anything else. But if you're doing an X-Men movie that's supposed to be a huge X-Men story, and you're doing it without Wolverine, it's never going to feel right. It's not going to feel right. You can only bend the concept that made it work so far. The Dark Phoenix movie, we'll get into when we do all of them, but it had its problems in production. There's a lot of rumors that things were cut off. We know for a fact that it was supposed to be 3 movies. So there probably was some meat there that we'll never get to see. That could have been cool. But in my head, I'm just not as excited about a Dark Phoenix movie where I don't have Cyclops, Jean, and Wolverine.
Yeah, exactly. Like, they felt like such an important core to the Dark Phoenix, like, just the saga. And you cut out Wolverine undermines that whole point of, like, Wolverine have to take on this responsibility that no one else would take up. And that was what Logan was about, is like he takes up all this responsibility, helping Professor X get through all his trauma and his aging and his powers freaking out. Like, even I liked what he said about the Reavers, like misunderstanding power. Like, that's kind of how I felt too when they approach Logan. They have this weird reverence for him, but they don't care about the people they're preying upon or anything, which is what Logan always did. I think Logan is such a great movie, and it deserved all the accolades it got, because a lot of it was based upon you having seen Hugh Jackman evolve over all these years. I mean, you didn't have to see all the X-Men movies, but you just had to have the idea of like Hugh Jackman being Wolverine to have this kind of impact, which is what I really appreciate about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It is the culmination of a long story. I think it probably does work on its own. It'd be hard for me to say. Impossible, in fact. But I think it does put a nice cap on all of the good work done for a very long time at that point. It also has like the most badass like end titles ever.
Yeah.
So the impact of this is really opening the door to these rated R dramatic superhero films, or comic book based films, we should say. Deadpool, I think, is kind of in a different vein.
Yeah, that's regardless. A comedy. That's more like a Rick and Morty vein than anything else.
Yeah, it's a little raunchy. It's, it would have to be R to deliver what it is. But I don't think you get Joker without Logan.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
I don't think anyone would have had enough faith in that type of project without Logan. Because, like, Deadpool wouldn't lead you to believe that would work. Logan could.
And now Joker has all these accolades, too, and that's probably going to start off a whole new wave of, like, R-rated superhero movies, which I look forward to. Both Joker and Logan have been pretty good. I'm sure all of them will just have one-word titles as well.
Yeah. It's good for everybody, I think.
Like Clark, Bruce.
Bruce. Is that a Hulk movie or a Batman movie?
That's the mystery. That's how you're going to advertise it.
It's just called Bruce, and it's a superhero movie. So this is where we have to, I think, pose what I think is somewhat of an unfortunate question. There have been a lot of rumors recently. Hugh Jackman has been talking to Marvel Studios about showing up in perhaps the Multiverse of Madness.
If it's a one-off, I can agree with, but, like, I do not want to see another movie with Wolverine in it.
Here's my thing. I don't care about other Wolverines.
Yeah, I should clarify. Hugh Jackman specifically.
I don't want Hugh Jackman to show up as that Wolverine in some, like, cameo in the multiverse. For two reasons. One, it's done. Like, I feel like it's done. Two, that does a real damage to the next Wolverine, which we're certainly getting. Like, we're going to get an X-Men movie from Marvel Studios. If you think for a second that they're not going to bring out the big guns for that, I think you're out of your mind. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't imagine. Because Marvel Studios, one of their things now, as they recover characters, has been, we're going to do it right. And I can't imagine they don't want that shot of, like, a Cyclops, Jean Grey, Wolverine, like, Beast, Professor X, like, core X-Men movie. The one thing in my head that I would kind of accept is if they were going through, like, a multiverse thing, and they were making it clear, like, this was not the X-Men movies Wolverine, it is a version of Wolverine from one of the worlds, and he showed up in, like, the brown costume, I might be able to, like, mentally handle that. Because my favorite thing in Apocalypse is when he shows up looking like Marvel Comics presents Weapon X, like, with the helmet on, like, snarling. Give me one more thing like that and I'll be okay. But I do not want, like, heavy involvement of the character.
I would be fine if they actually do, like, one episode, but it cannot be, like, just a Wolverine episode. It would have to be, like, Wolverine meets Wolverine or something weird and wacky like that. I'd be okay with that. But, like, I don't want them pretending to continue the story of Wolverine. I'm fine if it's some weird, like, dumb cameo or something like that. Because that's inevitable. I mean, Hugh Jackman can try to run away from this as much as possible, but Disney, they get your claws into you. They'll drag you back in.
Yeah, it's risky. And we have now this risky precedent set by Into the Spider-Verse where, like, people now know what a multiverse is.
Yeah.
And as cool as it can be, I'm afraid we might diminish things because of it.
Well, the funny thing about Wolverine is that you don't see a whole lot of multiverse versions of him, and it's not like Spider-Man, where it's like, Spider-Man but a pig, Spider-Man but noir. Like, it's weirdly enough with Wolverine, he's constant in, like, every single universe.
Yeah, the Age of Apocalypse, missing hand. Hand still has claws.
It's never, like, something weird where it's like, oh, this is Wolverine but a detective. It's like, well, he already did that. He lived for 400 fucking years.
I think that has a lot to do... like, the Spider-Verse thing, especially, was very specific in Marvel. Like, Marvel doesn't tend to go into multiverse. Like, DC, any character, there's, like, 20 multiverse versions of them, if that few.
And all of them have at least reset the universe once.
Yeah, they're about to do it again, baby. But, yeah, I kind of hope that Logan is the end of the run in a very real way for Hugh Jackman, and Patrick Stewart, for that matter. I think that there's no more commentary on those characters that needs to be made with them in that role. When you get a new actor in there, yeah, you have opportunities to explore different aspects of them because you're going to get a different performance, you're going to get a different interpretation. I think this should be it for that version of that world, and I'm excited to see what they come up with for the next version.
Right, there's nothing more to say after Logan. Like, Logan had, like, subtle race issues, subtle military issues, subtle government issues, like the fact they're on the border of Mexico and the US and they get involved with military and gangsters. The fact that they're saving, like, immigrant kids from, like, a facility. Like, it says it all without saying anything. And that's what I really love about Logan. You can't say anything more. I mean, inevitably they will bring the X-Men back. There's rumors we'll probably get into a bold prediction at one point, but it's... Yeah, I'm fine with one Wolverine cameo, but that's it, Disney. You get one.
Yeah. You hear that? You get one. Everyone's going to be real mad if you don't. Well, I guess that brings us to the end of what we want to discuss. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to follow, rate 5 stars, give thumbs up, hit a bell. Whatever way you're listening to, make sure you're figuring out a way to keep listening to us and to make us look good. We also want to thank our friends at Toy Store Guide. They got a great site that if you're looking for some toys in your area, toy stores aren't exactly the most prominent thing in the world anymore. And Dave and the guys over at Toy Store Guide are doing a real good job of documenting that across the country.
Yeah, if you need to find a Wonder Woman Princess of Themyscira statue, pick that up. It's a really cool statue.
There you go. Talk to Toy Store Guide. You can catch us on all prominent social media. Maybe not all of it, most of it, right?
Most of it.
But if you type in Dissecting Fiction into Google and put whatever the thing you're looking for us on next to it when you type in Dissecting Fiction on Google, I'm sure you'll find us. You think of anything else important?
I do find it funny that there's a Wolverine trilogy that caps off the X-Men, but there's still X-Men going on.
Yeah. There's still, I mean... Look, Dark Phoenix wasn't that bad. We can get into it another time, though. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Kutlick.
And thank you for listening.